January 1874. A blizzard had swept across the frontier between Fort Phil Kearny and Sheridan, Wyoming. On that trackless expanse of snow, where the wind screamed like knives and darkness swallowed the sky, a lone woman stumbled forward. Her cloak was in tatters, her lips frozen and cracked, her trembling hands wrapped protectively around her swollen belly. There was nothing behind her, no home, no kin, no path back. And no one was following anymore, because they knew the storm would take care of the rest. When she finally collapsed into the snow, her breath faltering, only one thought remained clear in her fading eyes. My child must live, even if I don't. But just as the cold began to swallow her whole, a dark figure emerged through the white squall. A man silent, a rifle on his back, eyes cold and still as the Highland granite. He didn't ask her name. He simply said, "If you're still breathing, don't die out here." Then, like a fragile stitch sewn into a torn fate, he lifted her into his arms and vanished into the forest. When Sarah Hale awoke, she no longer felt the cold, only darkness, the scent of pinewood smoke, and the distant wail of wind brushing past rough wooden walls. Every breath sliced her chest like a blade. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw herself collapsing into the snow again. But this time, someone had caught her. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't that final warmth before death. Someone was real, and she was still alive. She opened her eyes slowly, as if her eyelids were weighted with lead. A coarse wooden ceiling loomed overhead, flickering shadows cast by firelight dancing across it. Warmth wrapped around her frozen body. Her belly still rose under the blankets, tight, swollen. The child had not abandoned her. Her heart beat weak but steady. When she tried to sit up, pain rippled from her hips through her spine. A small sound from the corner of the room made her freeze. Someone sat near the hearth, a large man in a weathered leather coat, broad-shouldered, head bowed low. He didn't look at her. He simply sat there, whittling a piece of wood with a short blade. The fire lit half his face, thick beard, sharp lines, eyes so deep and dark they gave nothing away. Not warmth, not menace. Just stillness. Sarah didn't know where she was. Only that this wasn't the camp where the men had killed John, her husband, dead from a failed robbery he once believed would buy them both a clean way out. They'd torched the hideout, looted everything, and left her in the snow because, in their words, "That belly's slowing us down." She had expected death to come quickly. But instead, this man, silent and unreadable, had brought her here, kept the fire burning, and left her wrapped in warmth. She didn't know his name or what he wanted, but her instincts told her. He wasn't like the others. The air inside the cabin felt as thick as the snow clinging to the roof outside. Sarah didn't speak. She just lay there, watching the fire dance, listening to the pop and crackle of sapwood. She felt peace, but the fragile kind, like fog before dawn. In her heart, there was no sudden gratitude. Only one question: why? Why would a stranger save her? But in that firelight, and the hush of a room built against storms, she understood. Questions could wait. For now, she needed only to breathe, to last one more night. Outside, the wind still screamed like a funeral horn drifting over the plains. But inside, under thick blankets, with a silent man sitting by the fire, Sarah, for the first time since John died, felt she might survive. Not because of hope, but because of the child inside her, and because a stranger hadn't asked for her name. The small cabin sat buried deep within the thick Wyoming pines, its roof blanketed by snow like a white funeral shroud. On the first morning, Sarah truly woke. The sky had yet to pale. Darkness clung to the corners, and the wind still lashed the walls with bitter force. Inside, the air held the scents of smoked meat, warm ash, pine resin, and something quieter, something of a man who had lived alone too long. No footsteps, no voices, just breathing, and the occasional snap of a log splitting in the fire. Elijah Carter still didn't speak much. When he saw her trying to sit up, He simply placed a tin cup of warm water on the rough wooden table and returned to his seat by the hearth, as if the gesture meant nothing at all. But to Sarah, that quiet act echoed louder than words. She still didn't know whether to trust him. But there was no threat in his eyes, no weight in his gaze. The hand that set down the water-calloused and work-worn carried no demand, no pity. Just the motion of a man who'd seen someone dying and refused to let her die. The days that followed passed slowly, like snow melting from a rooftop. Sarah asked little, Elijah offered nothing. He left before dawn each morning, coat pulled tight across broad shoulders, rifle slung over his back, and returned near dusk with wood or fresh game. Everything he did, sharpening his blade, tending the fire, stirring a simple stew he did, with a precision that spoke of survival more than comfort. His life was measured in efficient steps and quiet resolve. She watched him at first out of caution. But as time passed, she watched out of something else. A kind of remembrance that men like this could still exist. Men who didn't demand her story. Who didn't ask her to explain what had brought her to a near-frozen death in the middle of nowhere. Who just let her be. Elijah never once asked about the child she carried. But when he saw her falter with a sharp twinge in her side, he brought extra blankets, fed the fire higher, and placed a bowl of stew within her reach. No comment, no gentle gaze. And somehow, that made her feel safer than kindness ever had. On the third night, Sarah woke from a nightmare gunshots. John's voice screaming, fire crackling through camp, shadows walking away from her without looking back. Sweat coated her skin despite the heat. She bolted upright, gripping the edge of the cot like it might save her from drowning. Elijah was already sitting by the fire. He didn't speak, just glanced at her once, then turned back to feed another log into the flames. The fire rose. Light spilled across the blanket covering Sarah's shoulders, and in that moment, she realized something had changed. This wasn't a place to die anymore. It could be if she let it, but if she had the strength, this might just be the place to start over. Not with words, not with forgiveness, just with the quiet truth that someone was still sitting there, in the dead of winter, keeping the fire alive. The snow had not yet melted, but something in the air had changed. The wind no longer screamed through the trees all day. The sun, though brief, now pierced the gray clouds for moments at a time. And inside the cabin, Sarah was no longer just a body wrapped in blankets waiting to survive. She began to move, first to wash her face with the warm water Elijah left near the hearth, then to sit up and sip the soup instead of lying still. Then slow, halting steps across the wooden floor. Pain gripped her back, knees, and the low curve of her belly, reminding her that the child inside was growing every day, filling not just her body but her mind. Elijah never stopped her. When she staggered and caught the wall for balance, he gave a light hand to her shoulder, just for a moment, and then stepped back, letting her try. That quiet respect caught in her throat. In the world she had come from, she had known too many hands that grabbed, too many voices that tightened like rope around her will. Here, silence made space to breathe. On the 8th day, she asked his name. Elijah gave a simple answer. Carter. No place. No backstory, just a name. When she told him hers, Sarah Hale, he gave a faint nod, as if he already knew. He didn't speak again. But in that shared glance, they both recognized it. Each carried ghosts. That evening, as fire crackled and snow fell outside like fine ash, Sarah spoke a little about John, the husband she had once believed was her escape. They'd married when she was 16, just south of Fort Worth. It had started with passion, then turned to fear. John was volatile, drank often. When no one would hire him anymore, he joined a gun smuggling ring along the Mexican border, then moved deeper into outlaw life with dreams of one last job before we disappear. That last job ended with his death, the camp in flames, and Sarah abandoned in the snow. Elijah didn't interrupt. He just sat, hands resting on his knees, gaze fixed on the fire. When she fell silent, he didn't ask more. But long after she thought he'd gone quiet for good, he spoke. My son died in winter. Roads were blocked with snow. I was stuck in town, my wife home alone. The boy came down with fever. Sarah turned toward him quietly. Eliza, my wife sent word. The message never reached me. By the time I got back, they were both cold under the quilts. I buried them behind a little log house in Kentucky. Then I left. No one saw me go. She said nothing. Neither did he. In the dark, there was only the sound of breath. 2 people, just a few feet apart. But between them stretched miles of memory and things too broken to name. And yet, in that quiet, Sarah realized something. This wasn't just a place to hide from snow. This was where the shattered came not to reclaim what they lost, but to sit still until life gave them a reason to stand again. And now, for the first time, she wondered. Perhaps the child she carried was that reason. For both of them. By the 3rd week, the sun began to linger a little longer, though the sky still hung heavy with gray. The snow around the cabin had thinned just enough for Elijah to travel farther each morning without leaving prints too deep. Sarah had grown used to being alone for a few hours. She'd learned how to tend the fire, reheat the stew, fold the blankets. Small, simple acts that made her feel something close to normal again, a feeling she never thought she'd reclaim. That afternoon, Elijah returned later than usual. He stepped inside with a thin crust of snow clinging to his coat and eyes darker than she'd ever seen them. Sarah was sitting at the table, mending an old towel. She looked up. Elijah said nothing at first. He hung his rifle on the wall, shed his coat, and sat down slowly, elbows resting on the table. Silence settled between them like a held breath. Sarah didn't ask, but her heartbeat quickened. 4 men, Elijah finally said, voice low and rough. I spotted them near the southern ridge. Not hunters, not local. Sarah set her needle down. Her fingers had gone cold. Her belly tightened in response, as if sensing what was coming. They asked if anyone lived out here. Asked if anyone had seen a woman. About your height. Pregnant. The room emptied of sound. Sarah stood slowly, arms folding around her stomach. Her face turned pale. She knew. She'd always known this day would come. Just not this soon. Elijah? I know, he cut in, still staring into the fire. No need to explain. I know who they are. She turned away, hands trembling. They'll come back, she whispered. They'll burn this place to the ground just to drag me out. Elijah stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just a sliver. Snow still blanketed the porch, but something far off in the tree line, something unseen, had begun to stir. They won't lay a hand on you, he said, voice steady and resolute. Sarah turned toward him, eyes wide and shining with fear. You don't have to do this, Elijah. I'm just a stranger to you. You don't owe me anything. He looked at her then, and for the first time, the armor around his gaze cracked. Not with anger, not with blame, but with the quiet grief of a man who once failed to save those he should have. It's not about what I owe, he said. It's about not watching someone else get buried under snow. She didn't reply. She couldn't. She just nodded. Slightly, gratefully. That night, neither of them slept. Elijah cleaned and checked his rifles. Sarah packed a small satchel water, dried bread, a blanket, a box of ammunition. She even took the pistol he had once taught her to use, wiping it clean with a worn cloth. Not because she longed to fight, but because this time she would not be left behind. As moonlight spilled through the cabin window, Sarah leaned against the wall, hands resting over her belly, feeling the gentle kick of life inside. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was running anymore. She was preparing to stand her ground. Dawn broke slowly, as if even the sun hesitated to witness what was about to unfold. Frost coated the porch steps. Inside the cabin, the fire still smoldered in the hearth, but no one sat near it. Elijah had gone out while the sky was still black. He hadn't spoken a word when he stepped through the door, just gave Sarah one last look, a small nod. Enough to say what didn't need saying, There was no room left for luck now. Sarah stood inside, pistol laid ready on the wooden table, the chamber loaded. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes no longer held panic. She knew where every window was, every blind spot. Elijah had shown her. "You only pull the trigger when there's no other choice," he'd told her. "Not to kill, just to make sure they stop coming." Hoofbeats echoed in the distance. 1, then 2, then 4. Slow but certain, like a funeral drum rolling over the white plain. Sarah gently pulled back the curtain and peeked through the narrow slit. 4 men, dust-choked coats, wide-brimmed hats, pistols slung high. The leader thin, long-faced, a smirk carved permanently across his mouth, dismounted first, stepping toward the edge of the cabin fence. Elijah was already there, rifle slung loosely at his side, his boots planted like roots in frozen earth. He didn't move. "Morning," the man said, drawling out the word like honey laced with venom. "Heard someone's been living up this way?" "Not open to visitors?" Elijah replied, eyes steady. "Well, that's a shame. See, we're looking for someone pretty little thing. Dark hair, round belly. Word is she slipped out of a real mess down Fort Worth way." Elijah didn't blink. The wind behind him swept through the trees like knives unsheathed in the dark. "You understand?" the man said, stepping closer. "There's property missing from the Howley family. We're just here to claim what's ours." "No one here," Elijah answered flatly. "And if there were, that'd be between her and God." A long pause. The man's hand drifted slowly toward his belt. Elijah didn't flinch. "Careful, Carter," he said softly. "Law's real thin out here. Accidents happen." "I know," Elijah said. "And accidents tend to happen to men who don't stop when they should." Before the words fully settled, a gunshot cracked through the cold. The lead rider dropped, blood spraying from his shoulder. The other 3 scattered, drawing their weapons, firing wild. But Elijah had already vanished into the timber wall, his movements silent, precise. Sarah ducked below the window, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. Gunfire ripped the silence clean, deliberate shots. No screams, no chaos, just winter air shredded by lead. And then quiet. A minute passed. Then another, no sound beyond the wind. The cabin door creaked open. Elijah stepped inside, the smell of gunpowder still clinging to his coat. His eyes swept the room before settling on Sarah, still standing, still holding her breath, her pistol untouched. "It's done," he said. Sarah dropped the pistol and rushed to him, her hands pressing against his chest, needing to feel that he was whole. Elijah caught her gently, not tightly, but enough to stop her shaking. She didn't sob, but tears slipped free anyway. Elijah didn't wipe them away. He just pressed his forehead to hers, his eyes closing. "You're safe now." But before she could respond, Sarah suddenly buckled, one hand gripping her belly. "Elijah," she gasped, breath hitching. "The baby." The pain came without warning, not the lingering ache of past wounds, but a deep, primal force, tearing through her hips and spine, splitting her from within. Sarah gasped, clutching Elijah's coat with wide, terrified eyes. It wasn't that she didn't know this day would come. It was that it came too suddenly, too soon, after the storm of blood and bullets had just passed. "Elijah," she hissed through clenched teeth, sweat already beading on her brow. It's time." Elijah didn't need to hear it twice. He swept her up from the floor as if she weighed nothing and carried her swiftly to the bed. His hands, which had held a rifle with deadly precision just hours before, moved urgently, but never shook. He lit the lanterns, stoked the fire higher, casting a fierce glow across the cabin walls as if to drive back the second storm, now roaring inside. Sarah cried out again, a raw, unfiltered scream torn straight from the core of her being. She was no longer a fugitive, no longer just a survivor. In that moment she was a mother, balanced between life and death, not because of violence but because of birth. "Elijah," she sobbed, pain cracking her voice. I can't do this! Yes, you can, he said, voice steady as forged steel. And you will. He placed warm cloth beneath her back, rinsed his hands in cold water, his gaze never wavering. He supported her with one arm, propped her legs with blankets, and braced her body as the next contraction tore through her. Sarah gripped his wrist so hard her nails broke skin. Time blurred into a cycle of agony and gasping silence. The fire blazed, casting light across Elijah's face, drenched in sweat but unwavering. No midwife, no medicine. Just a wooden cabin, two shattered souls, and a child arriving into this world through pain, blood, and belief. Push, Elijah urged, his voice low but firm. You're almost there. Push, Sarah. She screamed a sound so fierce it shook the rafters, ancient and sacred. And then, in the stillness that followed, a piercing cry rose into the warm air. Not a cry of pain, not a cry of fear, but life. Sarah collapsed back onto the mattress, breath ragged, tears and sweat streaking her face. Elijah wrapped the newborn in a clean towel, wiping her tiny face, clearing her mouth and nose. And then he smiled for the first time. His voice cracked as he spoke. It's a girl. Sarah opened her eyes, barely able to lift her trembling arms. Elijah placed the child against her chest. Warm, slick, red-faced, and alive. Sarah looked down at her, her cracked lips moving softly. Then, in a whisper no louder than a prayer, she said, Amelia. Amelia Rose. The baby shifted, her crying easing as she pressed against her mother's heart. Elijah sat beside the bed, exhaustion carved into every line of his frame. His hands were stained, but his eyes gleamed like someone who had just found what he thought was forever lost. Sarah looked up at him, voice shaking. Thank you. I couldn't have done it without you. Elijah shook his head, brushing her damp hair gently aside. You did this, he said quietly. You and her. Sarah didn't argue, but she knew the truth. Without the man who'd kept the fire burning, who stayed through every storm without asking for anything, they wouldn't be here. None of them had conquered the world. But that night, they had saved each other. And that for once was enough. Time passed like meltwater. Slow, steady, quiet, yet powerful. Each day, the snow outside the cabin receded a little more. The pines, once cloaked in white, now wore hints of green. Birds returned at dawn, their short, bright calls softening the silence that had once gripped the cabin so tightly. Inside, life was blooming too. Amelia Rose slept soundly in a simple wooden cradle Elijah had built by hand. It had been a quiet surprise one morning. Sarah woke to find the cradle beside her bed. No explanation offered, no smile. Just something Elijah had made in silence, like everything he did. Never seeking praise, only presence. She didn't ask. She simply placed her daughter into it, gently patted her back, and knew without words that part of Elijah's heart had been carved into the wood. Sarah healed slowly. Her body ached, her shoulders sagged with fatigue, but her eyes no longer looked lost. Each day she pushed herself to take a few more steps inside the cabin. Elijah never pressed her. Sometimes he offered a hand when she faltered. Other times, he simply left a warm cup of water within arm's reach when he knew she wouldn't ask. He never hovered, but he was always there. They spoke more now. Not about grand things. Just pieces small, worn, and real. Elijah told her of Kentucky, of the apple tree his wife once planted, of winters so hard the ground refused to yield even for the dead. In return, Sarah shared memories of the first time she saw the ocean, of a mother lost too young, and of a dream she once had to open a small dress shop just outside Fort Worth. An old dream, she said with a soft laugh, eyes distant through the window. Not so old, Elijah replied. And in his eyes then, something had shifted. Something no longer cold. One afternoon, as Amelia slept curled in Sarah's arms, she asked quietly, Did you ever think you'd have a family again? Elijah sat near the fire, mending a worn bridle. His hand stilled. He stared into the flames. "No," he answered, voice low. "I thought that part of me was gone." Sarah didn't speak. She looked down at her daughter, the tiny hand twitching gently in a dream. Then she murmured, almost to herself, "Maybe it comes back. Not the same, but still ours." That evening, as Elijah carefully carved Amelia Rose into the wood above the cabin door, each letter slow but sure, Sarah stood behind him, her arms wrapped around her child, her eyes stinging. Not from sorrow, but because for the first time in her life, she saw a home being built. Not from bricks or beams, but from quiet acts, from shared silences, and from a name etched into soft pine above a door that never locked. Spring came late to the Bighorn Range. The snow melted slowly, revealing cracked, muddy earth beneath. Patches of tender grass began to sprout across the thawing ground. And atop a small ridge, the cabin stood unchanged, though everything inside had shifted beyond recognition. Elijah still left each morning, checking traps, mending the last fence broken by the final storm. Sarah had begun bringing Amelia outside for short walks, wrapping her daughter in soft fabric to feel the breeze on her cheeks, the warmth of sunlight across her eyelids. She was no longer a fugitive. She was a mother introducing her child to the world. But within her, a quiet question had been growing with every sunrise. How long will we stay here? Not because she didn't love this place. On the contrary, it was the stillness that made her wonder. About a town, a market, a school, a tailor's shop she once dreamed of. A place where Amelia might learn to read, write, and smile at strangers without fear. That afternoon, Elijah set down the coil of rope he'd been repairing, washed his hands in the basin, and sat near the window where light stretched long across the floor. Sarah was rocking Amelia to sleep. He stayed silent for a long while. Then, softly, so gently it might have been mistaken for a breath, he said, "Winter's over. The snow's gone. You could head east to town. Start again." Sarah looked up. The words landed like a train whistle in the night. Not unexpected, but still sharp. "You're saying I should leave?" she asked slowly. Elijah met her gaze. He didn't flinch. "Number, I'm saying you could, if that's what you want." She stared at him for a long time. In his eyes there was no plea, no resistance, only truth. He would let her go. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared enough not to hold her by force. She turned to Amelia, still asleep, her tiny fingers curled around the hem of her mother's blouse. And then Sarah rose, walked to Elijah, and without a word placed her hand against his cheek, small, worn, but warm. "And what if I don't want to go?" she asked. Elijah blinked. For the first time, he didn't answer right away. Sarah smiled softly, a sadness laced in the curve of her lips. "I've been running for years. From my husband. From shame, from shadows. But I'm tired now. I don't want to run anymore. Not when I've finally found a place that feels like mine." Elijah took her hand and pressed it against his chest, where his heart beat steady and alive. "I'm not sure I deserve this," he whispered. "You don't have to be sure," she replied. "I just need you here." For the first time, they kissed. Not urgently, not out of desperation. Just two people who had lost everything, choosing to stay not because they were told to, but because their hearts had quietly agreed. And in that quiet cabin tucked deep among the pines, there was no music, no grand gesture. Just one truth being rewritten forever. A home, a man, a woman, a child, and a promise not of forever, but simply, we'll try. Summer arrived like a whisper, unhurried, gentle. The grass grew knee-high. Trees in the deep forest began to lower their first blossoms. Young deer started appearing near the creek each evening. And from the old wooden cabin on the ridge, a single lantern still burned every night like a promise made without ceremony. Elijah carved new patterns around the name Amelia Rose above the doorframe. The knife was dull now, his hands a little unsteady, but the lines came carefully. Sarah had coaxed a patch of garden to life behind the cabin carrots, onions, wild mint. Some afternoons, they sat side by side and watched Amelia crawl across the floorboards for the first time, her tiny hands reaching for slivers of light cutting through the wooden slats like something magical. No one spoke of what had come before. The bodies buried beneath last season's snow, the names that once froze their blood, the journeys that had nearly killed them. What remained now was the steady rhythm of a child breathing through the night, and the sound of birds unfolding wings at dawn. One evening, as the sky turned a deep molten red, Sarah asked quietly, "Do you think we'll ever see them again? The ones who came for me?" Elijah looked out toward the trail that led down to Harrow Flat. Grass had reclaimed it, no hoofprints, no dust. He shook his head. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not. But if they come, they won't find what they came for." Sarah frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Elijah smiled faintly, then bent and kissed the forehead of his daughter sleeping against her shoulder. "They came looking for a frightened widow, someone barely holding on. But now there's only the three of us, and we're not afraid anymore." Sarah nodded, and in that quiet she understood. The past hadn't vanished, but it no longer had the power to define her. That night, with Amelia asleep in her cradle, Sarah sat on the porch, sewing a dress for the baby, her eyes tracing the soft glow from the hearth inside. Elijah had dozed off in the wooden rocker, chin resting on his chest, breath slow and deep. She touched her belly, not swollen with life anymore, but full of something else. Stillness. Peace. Then, softly, she whispered, not to Elijah, not even to her daughter, but to the woman she once was, kneeling in the snow, ready to disappear. "We're going to be all right." And for the first time, it wasn't hope. It was belief.